All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the webinar with S&P Global, as we're going to go through some of the market intelligence data that they've been able to gather to help organizations defend data in the age of AI. We're being joined today by Senior Consulting Analyst for S&P Global Market Intelligence, Mark Ayer. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
We certainly can.
Oh, lovely. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Absolutely. My name is Ari Weil. I am the head of marketing for Sierra, and we are looking forward to trying to demystify for folks how business leaders and security leaders are really thinking about data security as they adopt cloud technologies and generative AI technologies and recognize the growth and the sprawl of data that I think many of you are probably experiencing in your own organizations. Mark, do you want to take us away?
Absolutely. Let's see here. Let's see. Yep, there we go. Thanks. Yeah. So let's see. Did we want to go through intros, or you want to just jump right in?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Mark here, senior, as Ari said, senior consulting analyst at S&P 451 Research. My focus is security. Obviously, I've been in the business about 20 years. My second go around as an industry analyst, and I also spent 12 years at IBM Security, focusing on security analytics and a number of other topics. Yep, that's my background.
Fantastic. And for myself, I've been in the IT industry for about, almost 25 years now, in security for the last 18 or so. Really excited to be joining Mark today to talk through this topic. And it's something that we're hearing a lot about in the industry at large, but certainly at Sierra from our prospects and customers on a daily basis. So maybe with that, we'll jump into some of the insight that 451 has been able to develop from surveying customers out in the market.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, so we conduct these surveys that we call Voice of the Enterprise, or VOTE, and we've been doing this for well over 10 years. I think we might have started around 2010, so probably going on 13 years now. And what we do is we send these out, obviously, on an annual basis. It's a very large number of people that we survey in multiple thousands. And what's really cool about that is that allows us to compare not only what people are doing right now, but also against historical data. And so what we did, and you'll see this in a few of these slides, is we'll either talk about what's happening now, and or we'll look at some of the historical, like last year versus this year type of compares. So one of the first things that we were looking at, when we started working with Sierra, was the key trends in sensitive data discovery and classification. And what was really interesting to me is that in the past, a lot of folks, they knew they sort of needed to do sensitive data discovery and classification, but it was maybe kind of further down on their priority lists. But what we found is that it's really starting to heat up, and there's a couple of reasons we'll get into in a little bit here. But what we did find in terms of asking the study participants what their plans were, first of all, a lot of them are planning to implement in the next 12 months. And the drivers, which are probably obvious to a lot of folks, but it's increased cloud priority and development, and things we're going to call it diffusion, which means that data is just spreading out everywhere, right? So all of a sudden, you can't just manually control this stuff, and assume that if you're compliant that you're secure. And we'll talk more about that too. So what we found was 39% of the people we surveyed are using sensitive data discovery classification today, but another 44%, which is really rare to see that kind of number, are planning to either implement in the next 12 months or are currently in a pilot or POC. And kind of dovetailing with that is another 71% that say they're going to increase spend over the next 12 months. So not only are they either using it or planning on using it, but they're also increasing the spend, which either indicates initial purchases, obviously, or they're increasing the footprint of their existing solution. And the other thing that we found is that implementation is a major roadblock for many, and we're going to talk about some of those hurdles and how to get over them in a little bit here.
That's great. No, that's really helpful. And I think, what we've been hearing from customers is very much aligned to this, specifically around this notion that as businesses adopt cloud technologies and they start to move data from on-prem or managed data centers to infrastructure as a service, that is just the beginning of the journey. Moving where you think about your server infrastructure, your networking, your overall sort of just hardware environment, so to speak, to the cloud is the beginning of a journey that needs to evolve your processes, the way you train people, the way you think about anything from promotion of an application to investigating any sort of incidents that occur. And what we've seen as a real challenge is as businesses move to become more data driven, and data starts going from production environments in an application to data warehouses and data lakes or data lake houses, as we move into SaaS environments for sharing and collaboration, that's where the silos of visibility have become really challenging. Because if you're in IT, you probably have your own IT service catalog. If you're in security, you've got your own sensitive data inventory. If you're in the global risk and compliance team, there again, you're looking at data through your own lens. And each of the tools that you'll procure will have their own way to do discovery. They'll have their own way to classify information, different levels of granularity. Some are more categorization based. Others are focused more on the nuances maybe of the regulations that they're designed to support or help companies comply with. And so what you end up with are a lot of individual snippets of visibility across a cloud ecosystem. And when the average environment, the average enterprise is using 10 plus clouds, that becomes a really challenging proposition, because now you get into, well, is it a sanctioned environment or not? If you're in security, that doesn't really matter, because you're ultimately responsible for securing the enterprise and keeping the business safe from data breaches and accidental disclosures. And so I think that's the reason that we're seeing people so aggressively moving into pilots or into proof of concepts for technology that's going to help give them that visibility, but also provide more reliable and more continuous discovery and classification. But I'm interested maybe to move on to the next slide. Before we do, we did want to post a poll and just ask our audience, as you think about discovery and classification, what sort of a priority is it for you? Because that'll help Mark and I as we go through the rest of the webinar. Is it something that you're evaluating right now? Are you scoping? You think you might have a need, but you're really trying to evaluate what's available in the market? Or do you think that this is something that you mostly have covered and you're not really that worried about it at the moment? All right, and it's great to see that so far the folks that are participating in the poll are letting us know that they're planning to upgrade in their scoping. So let's see what other information we can provide you as we go through some of the other data that the 451 group has. So here we go. We are going to move on to our next slide. Mark, take it away.
Yeah, sounds great. So let's dive into some of the key considerations around sensitive data discovery and classification. One of the first things, as with any big project, that you really need to understand, your and do your homework before you get started, right? And so you really need to understand, and your goal needs to be to understand your data risk and processes. And with today's incredibly accelerated development cycles, between Agile and all the other, SecOps and DevSecOps methodologies that are being deployed, that we're seeing that those risks can increase with every new application release if you don't bake these processes into that core development process. And so and then compounding the problem is that we've got cloud native data creation, which is also exploding, and it may not be subject to rigorous data controls and oversight. Because again, a lot of this stuff is done very, very fast, kind of at the speed of business, and people may not be really paying attention to those, putting those processes in place ahead of time. And then the other thing that's going on is that, between scripting and all the various DevOps processes, it can cause the data to really proliferate throughout the supply chain, which increases the risk even further, right? And makes it even harder to keep track of where this data is going. So that, at the end of the day, that really brings us back around to sensitive data discovery and classification, and why it is key to reducing risk, because that allows you to understand, your data, where your data is, and also, the exposures that those processes bring into play. And so you've really got to, as I mentioned, got to really bake those policy and compliance mandates into the core processes, which allows you to do your risk, security, and compliance personnel, or have those personnel guide the business and work closely with business stakeholders, to make sure everybody's on the same page. And at the same time, getting a complete picture of your data risk means that you have to consider all of those things, all the conditions, the processes, the identities that are touching those systems and who has access to them. And then the policies that are defined have to reflect those objectives. So Ari, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we're seeing here is the tale of two different paces of creating processes and moving things out to market. If I think about business units and developers, scripted processes, CI/CD, automation, that is the way that we are moving towards cloud native architectures and using microservices so that we can create better customer experiences faster. And you end up with those connected experiences that can evolve by individual components surging ahead instead of these monolithic sort of waterfall-based approaches that have been taken in the past. For security teams, that can pose a real challenge because if they think about their understanding of what is the data that my business is managing, that is typically based on a point in time understanding owing to the sort of technology that was available to security teams up until this point. If you look at data loss prevention as one example, or if you think about maybe a sensitive data inventory that is provided by a third-party vendor, those are typically created by security teams saying, well, this is the data that I know we have. Let me connect you to that environment. And then you define signatures, pattern matching, typically through regular expressions or sample data to say, this is the data that I know how to tell you to look for in that environment. And then basically you end up with, for those known data stores, for the known data classes, you will get some form of data classification back from those solutions. And the challenge with that, as you were saying, is if I add a new include to my application, then I could be consuming new data, I could be creating new data. I'm definitely managing things in a way that I wasn't before I included that new component. That is just as true of software supply chain. If the component that I was using yesterday has a new release that comes out today, and they've included new functionality that might generate a new database inside of the environment, or again, may consume or transit different types of information, that's not something that the business knows to notify a security team about. And the security team doesn't really have a native way to discover. And so what we're thinking about here is the reason for pursuing innovation in sensitive discovery and classification is that need to basically uncover these changes as they occur in the environment. And so you need something that is cloud native. What does that mean? It means that it knows how to find things as they come up, or it knows how to recognize that there was a change in something that it detected previously, including if something was removed from an environment, because that's all really important context for a security team to have if they're going to be looking for vulnerabilities or triaging an indication of compromise in the case of a suspected security incident. And so what I think we're going to see on the next slide are the trends that we're seeing in organizations as they see data proliferating. And so Mark, I'll turn it over to you, and then we're going to ask another question of the audience really soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Harry. Yeah, so as far as today's data security landscape, it's not going to be a big surprise probably to most of us, but, organizations are more cloud native, they have more data, and as I mentioned earlier, the agile and DevOps methodologies just only add to that complexity. Now, what you see there on the right, again, came from our Voice of the Enterprise data from this year. And this just shows the distribution of how many copies of business data people have across the organization. And if you average it out, it comes out to 5.21 copies, which in itself is kind of frightening. But also you think about how much of that data is in transit at any given point in time. And 66% of the people that we polled said that they transfer on-prem data to and from the cloud continuously. And the other thing that struck me about this chart is, so 5.21 is the average, but if you look at the right side of this chart and look at how many people, 11% have more than 10 copies across the organization. So this is kind of becoming an intractable problem, and it's not going down; it's continuing to go up, as time goes by. And as we kind of discussed before, there are more cloud native applications out there. 59% of the people we polled indicated that more than half of their applications are cloud native today. And in 2 years, that jumps, almost 20% to 77%. So, it's pretty clear what direction technology in the industry is going. At the same time, though, compliance and privacy issues are exploding as well, because obviously if you're having more copies of data in more places and you're not keeping on top of that, that's going to bite you, in terms of privacy and compliance. So naturally, the complexity and volume of the data is a top challenge. And we also found that improved compliance is the number 2 objective of people, that we surveyed. So that kind of makes sense. One is the problem with the amount of data, and then 2 is the fact that they have to then improve compliance. And we'll talk about this in a minute too, but one thing that a lot of folks I hope understand is that just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, and just because you're secure doesn't mean you're compliant. Those are very different things. And of course, Agile, as we spoke earlier, it's becoming the de facto work pattern, and our data does certainly clearly bear that up. 84% of the people that we surveyed have some DevOps implementation. 31% of them are using it exclusively, and 51% are deploying software apps to production on a weekly basis, or even more rapidly than that.
The interesting thing for us is when we ran our own independent study at Sierra, one of the things that we got back as a top priority for security teams, and specifically the more senior folks in a security organization, was advancing zero trust architectures. And when we think about how this data applies to a zero trust architecture, if you think about it, you're trying to achieve the principle of least privilege, understanding that you don't really have a perimeter anymore, that you've got applications and workloads and users who are all basically just doing what they were designed to do in their own capacities. And as a security organization, you're trying to minimize the potential threat surface across that continuum. And it's an always evolving set of considerations there. You've got more and different users, many of them maybe in this current reality you haven't even met face-to-face before. You've got contractors and third parties and remote employees all connecting via SaaS applications. Maybe you're using single sign-on, maybe you're using enterprise browsers. There's a number of different things that you can do to try to limit the way that threat actors and malware and other things can make it into your environment across your networks. But the reality is, when you're looking at scripted implementations, when you're thinking about how application architectures and the paradigm for how applications are being deployed and evolved is evolving, then the real challenge here with the copies of the data is that siloed visibility. It's the fact that it's hard to follow the data throughout its life cycle. So if I think about, for example, companies that are investing in CNAPP solutions like Wiz or Orca or Lacework or Palo Alto Prisma, in all of those cases, they're worried about the security posture of their cloud infrastructure. And that's critical for a modern business. There is also a rising tide of SaaS security posture management solutions out there that are looking at sanctioned SaaS applications to understand the security of those environments and what sort of sensitive data might be managed and transited across SaaS environments. But the problem is, a real use case, a real viable way that businesses operate today is that you've got your production applications and workloads in infrastructure. You've got the applications that you use for collaboration in SaaS. And then you've got platforms that you might use for analytics, for forecasting. Maybe you're also using, Force.com and other platforms as a service in order to launch applications. And the reality is, data is constantly traveling across all of those different clouds. And you need the ability to understand where it's flowing, why it's flowing there. If you need to be doing anything to secure the data, to control the data, to transform the data in order to remain compliant with security and privacy statutes. And if you're looking in the silos, you simply don't have the ability to identify those concerns. The other challenge is if you're using an application to secure your infrastructure, then it's going to be looking at things like, what software am I deploying? What critical vulnerabilities exist there? What sort of users am I allowing to access that environment? But it's not specializing on really understanding in detail what the data is in that environment. And we're starting to really hear loudly from security teams that the fatigue that they experience from these alerts that they receive that are devoid of context of data are making it challenging to actually secure the enterprise, because with all of the noise and the volume of alerts, it's hard to separate basically the signal to the noise and act upon the things that matter. So before we go forward, we had another poll question that we wanted to ask you. And specifically, as we discuss the rest of our data here, how mature do you consider yourself in the cloud? Are you all in, where everything that you do is cloud native at this point, and you've migrated all of your critical applications to the cloud? Are you cloud first, where anything new that you're developing in your organization will be developed in the cloud and you're encouraging your teams to take advantage of cloud architectures? Or is it really more of an it depends sort of a scenario? You know, if it makes sense, you'll evaluate or use cloud, but your business isn't really totally bought in. So far, we're seeing that from the audience, new development is starting in the cloud, which is something very common that we hear from folks in the industry. I'll just give this another moment before we move on to the next slide. And there we go. It looks like we are staying consistent with new development starts with the cloud. So Mark, maybe we can jump forward and say, what is so different as we move to the cloud? Like, what are the data security requirements and how are they changing?
Yeah, absolutely. And back on that poll question, that bears out what our research is showing too. Is that folks, they may not have completely converted all their legacy applications, but anything that's new, and especially if it's more business critical, they're considering themselves cloud first. So that's the first choice, and that's the direction they're going. And so that absolutely makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So in terms of process requirements around data security, I love this statement that security requires a live stream and not a selfie, right? And what that really means is that the historical point in time compliance checks just aren't adequate anymore. For a number of reasons that we already talked about. The environment is so dynamic, it's changing so rapidly that if you're doing once a day even or once a week, that's still not enough because things are just continuously changing. And one of the problems is that the compliance regulations have not kept up, right? They're just based on point in time controls. So yes, every month you have to ensure that you're compliant. Well, that's great. That gives you the checkbox to make sure your regulators are happy, but it doesn't mean you're secure. So what you really need to do is look into and lean into automation and autonomy. So by automation, that means that's the only way that you're really going to be able to get around the point in time problem is you have to automate it, because you certainly can't have people sitting there manually running these checks, on a per minute basis or whatever it might be, right? So you really need automation to keep pace with the speed and complexity that's going on, and also to keep on top of existing and new risks. Right. So again, somebody just drops a # included into some code. Now all of a sudden you've got a new risk. Do you want to find out about that in a month, or would you rather know about that, within a little bit of time after you code it?
Yeah,
and also lean into it. Oh, go ahead.
Please, no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, and also autonomy. Yeah, I got to get to the autonomy problem too, right? Which is that these systems need to operate kind of separately, dynamically, in continuously available environments, which don't affect the production systems. Because as any kind of a security product that is going to affect the a production system, be it performance or availability, whatever, is never going to fly, right? So it has to be autonomous and agentless so that you're not affecting those systems. And also that also tends to help deploy those products a lot more easily. Okay, Artie, go ahead.
No, thank you. That was great. I mean, I think this bears out with some of what we've seen from firms like PwC, where they interviewed board level executives, C-level executives, and asked them, how do you feel as far as the security of your environments, the security of your workforce as you've migrated to the cloud? And fewer than 40% actually said that they were confident that they were able to adapt processes, train their staff, and actually layer in the appropriate controls as they aggressively started to consume cloud technology. And part of that reason is also something that we saw in our survey, which showed that it was 70% of security leaders in North America felt that they were struggling to enable the business to leverage their data securely, which is a really problematic statement when you consider how people are experimenting with things like ChatGPT, OpenAI, other different models where businesses are moving forward with trying to use those chatbot assistants to make decisions. They're leveraging their own models and large language models from Google and Microsoft and others, trying to figure out what does it cost to train that model. And it's millions of dollars potentially that it takes to actually get a model trained on your data specifically if you're doing it yourself. And then you consider, well, what am I training it with? Do I understand the data that's in scope for any sort of a project that I might run with generative AI? Do I have visibility into that data to understand truly what it represents? And if I don't, how do I get that understanding? And that's where these cloud native architectures become so critical, because from an automation perspective, first and foremost, you can't afford to have a lead time of 9 to 18 months as you start to define the patterns and define the regular expressions and work maybe with third-party consultants to have them train up a tool or get a DLP, technology coded up with the appropriate pattern matching guidelines. And even if you do that, when do you trigger a scan? How do you evaluate whether a new database or a new data store or a new file share or something of that nature was added to your data landscape? If you're not autonomously allowing a technology to go out there and find these things for you to make yourself aware of them, then do you click scan once a day, once a week, once a month? Do you try to do it every hour? It would really depend on arguably how often you're pushing code updates, how often your environment's evolving. And unfortunately, that's just context that most security teams don't have because they don't have a mechanism to actually gain that insight from the line of business. And so when we look at the quote up on top or the comment about security requires a live stream and not a selfie, it really is required that you have technology that knows how to be continuous, to continuously discover, to continuously assess. And that was another thing that we saw was over 63% of respondents to our study said that automating data risk assessments was one of their top priorities to enable zero trust initiatives because the manual process in that survey-based approach was both so time consuming, but also didn't give them the confidence that they were getting full visibility into what data they manage. So if we think about process requirements, Mark, what are some of the key considerations?
Yeah, and before we jump into that, I meant to add to. I'm glad you brought up Gen AI. And because I'm doing some research into securing AI systems. A lot of people think of, well, how am I going to use AI to secure my systems? But how am I going to secure my AI systems? And one of the big concerns today, which speaks to the data proliferation, is the fact that a lot of those databases that are sitting underneath those models, they're vector databases, and it's just gibberish to humans, right? And so it can become quite a black box, just trying to figure out what data is in there, where is it going, is it leaking, all those kinds of other things. So I think that's a whole nother generation of sensitive data AI that we are just now starting to tackle, right? And so I'm very, very interested, and we're about to publish a spotlight on this topic on securing AI systems. So it's and I think we'll probably talk about more about that in a little bit. But anyway. So in terms of process requirements, the first thing that needs to happen is stakeholders absolutely have to be involved. They're the ones that own that data technically. They're the ones that make the key decisions, and a lot of times the budget decisions around data and security, right? So you've got to get them installed. And at the same time, if you don't, they may not really understand the gravity of the problem, right? And so you really got to have them on board and have them actively involved in the process. The second one, which is true of a lot of large projects, but you really need to think about deploying this iteratively. You can't just boil the ocean, as some people say. In other words, let's just do a vast implementation across everything. Just because it's just too complex. It makes a lot more sense to do it, in an implemented, or rather in an iterative deployment approach, that where you start with, moving into, continuous processing and automation. And then once you sort of got that going and you've got that, you're comfortable with that, then you can start to, apply policy and governance guidelines on top of that. And then the last point is really around defensibility of the remediation. So the fixes can be complex, and it's like anything, if you're in IT or in security and you've got an incident, a lot of folks, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's just turn something off, right? Or let's just, disable this user or disable that system. Well, without thinking about it, if you do that, you can significantly harm business operations, especially today, because that data is becoming more and more critical to your business. And so, really what you need to be able to do is think about that ahead of time, how remediation is going to fit into the overall strategy here and make it defensible, which means that the developers, the operators, because they'll have better controls, better visibility, it'll make it much easier for them to determine the remediation, and probably fix the problem without significantly affecting those critical business systems. And at the same time, that all folds into best practice methodologies as well.
100%. And I think it's a really interesting one, especially that last point. When we oftentimes will talk to a security team and we ask them, how confident are you in your data security strategy, in the tooling and the technology that you have at your disposal? One of the topics that ends up coming up quite a bit is the difference between issuing alerts and then actually prioritizing actionable remediation steps. And one of the things that we talk to a lot of folks in the analyst community about is this notion of automated remediation. And so I think, saying that remediation has to be defensible is a really important point, because one thing that happens, as an example, in organizations today quite a lot is you've got the tried and true sort of data security example of an S3 bucket that's exposed to the public internet. So if we think about an application architecture for a modern website, you might put your collateral that you want users to have access to for demand generation purposes into an S3 bucket. And you say, I don't have to encrypt this. It should be available to the public internet, because at the end of the day, I need people to see this on my website so that they understand what I can deliver as a business. This is true of financial organizations that have consumer banking products. It's true of retailers and travel companies, and you name it. The challenge becomes, if I look at sort of a rudimentary security classification scheme, having a data source, in this case, a bucket, exposed to the public internet is theoretically a violation of a security protocol. Now, is it true if the data is public? No, it's not. But if you don't have visibility into the data, then seemingly having public links or public exposure is a security vulnerability. And so you will get an alert that this exists. Security team might go in there and they would remove the public link, or they would set, public accessibility to false. Or if it's a file share, they'll take away maybe the global access permission so that anybody with the link can get to that file. And then somebody from the line of business will get an alert that their application's broken. And they'll go to IT instead of security, because that's who supports them. And IT will say, oh, you're right, there's a configuration issue here. They'll revert the configuration. And then you get into this cycle of security tool raises alert without any sort of context on the data. And then the teams are swirling, acting upon those alerts. The security team can't afford to ignore the alert. And they don't often have time, oftentimes have context on who the business owner is of the process of the application that they would have to go engage with. And that's really not the way that most of the organizations are trained to follow a process. And so you end up with this challenge of, I have too many alerts. I know that I need to address the alerts. I know that if I address them, I don't often feel like I'm actually making progress in my environment. And so one of the answers here is that iterative approach. It's saying, let's have a beachhead of our most critical sensitive data. That could be proprietary intellectual property. It could be customer privacy data that I have to comply with a statute for, like GDPR or CCPA. It could be that I'm going for a PCI certification or a SOC 2 certification or something of that nature. But if you take a project-based or a program-based approach and say, what is the actual data that is in scope for this program? And do I understand the data? Do I know where it resides, who has access to it, how they're using it, and what sorts of exposures do I have? That's a way that you can basically build a foundation that you would then iterate upon and get wider and wider and wider across your organization and your data landscape to really understand the data that you manage and how to keep it secure. The challenge with many businesses is that if you ask them, what is your most important, statute or framework to comply with, you might just get a list, because they're all applicable today and there are all meaningful impacts to the cost of doing business, to potential fines, to potential issues with trust with customers that would impact lifetime value. And so that prioritization can be a real challenge. Before we move on and talk about the next set of insights from S&P, I wanted to bring up our last poll question. And this is, how are you actually prioritizing data security for the next 12 months? Is it something that you're aggressively building out an architecture for because you have to comply with so many different statutes and frameworks? Is it you have some of the components, maybe you're investing in improving some, consolidating, maybe getting best of breed in others? Or are you just going to be reacting to any business needs that might arise and you're not actively searching for things in the marketplace today? So I'll give you just a second here to see what your approach is before we go on and see what the data recommends from S&P. And it looks like we're seeing that people have some components and they're investing based on the needs. So let's talk about what some of those pressing needs might be. Mark, when we talk about, some of the conclusions that you drew from your survey and how security leaders can really think about that prioritization, what did S&P find?
Yeah, so and this shouldn't be too big of a surprise after everything we just presented, but diffusion is inevitable, right? With the growth in cloud, the growth in third and end party or multiple party relationships increasing, the sensitive data requirements of business goals just have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed now, before it gets even worse. And this is only going to grow in time, right? Because you're going to have increasing copies of your data. It's going to exist in more places, and the importance of and sensitivity of that data will be diffuse as well. Will be spreading throughout not only the organization but your suppliers, the supply chain, partners, and so on. So it just continues to grow. And as we mentioned earlier, embrace automation, and we kind of touched on AI and ML. In this case, leveraging it to aid with security, right? So the automation reduces your time to value, allows you to continually understand what your risk posture is, classifying and discovering data, and so on. But then if you can add advanced AI and ML techniques to your existing intellectual property, and use custom logic, use your custom business logic to improve those processes, and makes discovery, classification, and data risk assessments much more defensible, right? Because you're building in kind of a tribal knowledge, if you will, from within your organization. And at the end of the day, one of the biggest keys here is kind of the DevOps whole methodology, which is to say, these folks have to work together. We have to provide them with a better developer, operator, and even analyst experience, so that they're all playing from the same sheet music, as you will. So if you can improve that experience and just bake it into those processes, then that SecOps process is going to work the way it was intended. And we're going to have less and less kind of 911 calls when an issue happens and somebody flips a switch and then a system goes down, type of thing.
Totally agree. And I think the diffusion part is the most the part that resonates with me, I think, the best. And that's where, this is just going to increase over time as businesses really start thinking about how to enable more and more interesting ways to engage customers, as customers start to become more demanding and need businesses to provide them with new and connected experiences. There's just going to be more research done on how are people engaging and who is consuming our products, what are the requests that they're making, what is the customer satisfaction from it, what's going on in the industry. And so we'll see things like data warehouses and data lakes and data lake houses just expanding in use. But also when we think about generative AI and the promise of being able to have a machine and a large model go out and look for, are there topics that we're seeing consistently from the feedback that we're getting from our customers? Are there elements of our application that people are interacting with more frequently? Or do we see trends in the way that we penetrate a new market and maybe go to market in a new country that we can use to learn how to basically advance and grow globally more effectively and with lower friction? You're going to see more people read into the data from an organization, which is going to require security teams to have more advanced technology so that AI can meet AI and really keep pace with the way the data evolves and diffuses across an organization. And so, this has been an insightful conversation, Mark. I thank you so much for helping to take us through it. I thank everybody who joined us today for your participation in the polls. Hopefully you got something positive from it. And at this point, we didn't have any organic questions coming through, but we did get some great insight from you on the polls. And I'm sensitive to the fact that we've been going for about 40 minutes. And so I'll give you just a moment to see if you do have any new questions to post. Otherwise, I'm very happy to let people move forward with their busy days here midweek. And Mark, again, as we wait here just a minute, I thank you for going with me into the discussion on generative AI and also looking into some of the survey data that you guys were able to generate.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I can answer a couple of common questions that tend to come up. One is, can the participants get copies of the slides? And yeah, absolutely. That's fine. I believe you folks will be posting the recording and the slides. So yeah, please feel free to do that. And then secondly, a lot of folks will ask us if this data that we mentioned and cited in the presentation is publicly available. And the answer is no. I mean, it's publicly available in terms of the fact that it's in this presentation now. But if you are a 451 subscriber, then you have full access to all that data. And otherwise, it's just the stuff that's in here. But yeah, you'll find a lot of our data out in the public anyway. But yeah, that's all part of our subscription curated content.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and everybody who registered for today's webinar will get a copy of the recording. And then we'll also be sending you the Vanguard report that was generated that has a lot of these insights in it from 451. And then as Mark said, any additional research that you might be interested in getting either from Sierra or from S&P Global will be available to you after today. But for now, I want to thank everybody for joining. Thank you for your attention. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.